Welcome to my videos about wheelbase. This is the first of 3 videos about wheelbase. Now, I filmed most of these in my garage instead of on this beautiful sunny day, but what I realized is that I never mentioned what wheelbase is or how it's measured. So, wheelbase typically on cars would be center of wheel to center of wheel, or axle. And we don't measure wheelbase on skateboards center of axle to center of axle because depending on what trucks you have, it changes it. So how we measure wheelbase on skateboards is from the center of these back bolts to the center of these bolts. So the holes on your board, inside to inside, the centers of them. That's how it's measured. So now that we know that, we can carry on to my videos in the garage about wheelbase. So the first subject I'm going to start with is decks specifically. I need to break this into 3 videos because it's a little bit dry and technical, and if you have a video that's longer than about 5 to 8 minutes, it's going to get really boring. So today is decks. So the first thing I did was I measured a whole lot of decks I have. Now I'm talking specifically decks within the 31.5 to 32.25 length range. And so these are going to be your street type decks for doing technical tricks. My boards don't really go under 8 inches and they don't go above 8.5 inches. So it's a pretty specific range. If you're looking for a video on boards like long boards and all kinds of different boards, bowl boards where you get up to 33 inches in length, this isn't going to be the video. So moving on, we are going to talk about wheelbase, but in order to get into wheelbase, we also need to talk about some of the other dimensions. So I measured all the noses and tails on all of the decks I have, and they are all roughly, the nose is almost always 7 inches long from the end of the nose to the first bolts. The tail is almost always 6 3/4 long, so it's a 1/4 inch shorter from the tail to the bolts. And this is fairly uniform on almost every deck, with the exception of maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. Now, the other thing I also checked was the angle of all of the boards. So that's actually really hard to measure because it doesn't start abruptly. It doesn't just go flat, 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 angle, flat. So what you'll notice is there's actually a curve on the nose and tail of the deck. So you can't measure the angle exactly, but averaged out, and on almost every single board, it was basically give or take 20 degrees. So I checked using one of these and my handy dandy speed square to check the angle. I'm an old school carpenter kind of guy, and that's how I check things. So give or take a degree, every single board was 20 degrees. 6 3/4 nose, 6 3/4 tail, 7 inch nose. So very similar. Now you might be wondering, so why do some boards feel so steep and other boards feel so mellow? Well, the reason is almost always going to be your wheelbase. So, the average wheelbase of your normal street type board that I'm talking about is going to be about 14 1/4. That's sort of your standard wheelbase. So let's measure these 4 decks that I have right here. This is the chalk that I was riding, and it has a 14 1/4 wheelbase. Yup, 14 1/4. So now let's go to the long end of the spectrum, and I have this friendship deck that I've ridden. And this one is 32 inches long in length. It was actually just a little over 32 inches, and this has the longest wheelbase of any deck I've ever ridden. This one is 14 3/4. In fact, it might even be 14 13/16. And that's a very large wheelbase. And because the nose and tail are roughly the same length in a lot of these things, what they do is they take it from this space here where it starts to turn up. So there's less space right here between the bolt and where the nose starts to go up. There's less space here on this deck than any of my other decks. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum, and then we have this chocolate deck. This one is a little bit shorter, 31 3/4, so it's about a 1/4 inch shorter, but the wheelbase is 3/4 of an inch shorter. So that would give you a 1/2 inch shorter wheelbase overall in relation to the deck. So this one is a 14 inch wheelbase, which I consider very short. In fact, I really don't like riding decks with 14 inch wheelbases because I'm a pretty tall guy. And then we've got another deck right here, this real deck that I loved. This one was 32 and 7/8 long, I believe. 31 and 7/8. I do that a lot. So 31 and 7/8 with a 14 and 3/8 wheelbase, which is a really nice wheelbase. It's not as big as 14 and a half, which is getting a bit hefty, and it's not as low as 14 and a quarter, which is a little bit small for me. It's that Goldilocks. 14 and 3/8 seems to be kind of my Goldilocks zone, and it works with both Indies or Thunders, but that's sort of a different subject. So now that we've talked about that, we still haven't gotten into why it makes it feel steeper or mellower. So I gotta move this stuff. And let's take a truck. Let's take this plank of wood. So what you need to think is your skateboard is a lever. So what we are going to do is we are going to take this. Your truck is your fulcrum of your lever. So what we need to think about is, here's your nose or tail, here's the rest of your board. Now, depending on where your truck is, and I'm going to exaggerate it for effect because that's the way you'll be able to grasp it, but imagine if you have the truck closer to the middle of the deck. It makes the front feel much lighter, right? So just by the very basic laws of a lever, this front feels much lighter because my fulcrum is closer to the center. So that's a short wheelbase. Makes the front of your board feel light. So now let's go to a long wheelbase, like the Friendship deck. And what that's going to do is it's going to make the front of your board feel quite heavy. So what I have found, oh wait, the other thing this also does is it lifts the front of your board up much higher. So if you have the Friendship deck that had 3/4 of an inch wheelbase bigger than the chocolate deck, I would be willing to bet that that measures pretty closely up here. I bet you the front of your deck gets at least 3/4 of an inch taller, if not a little bit bigger, because if you look at the shape of the triangle, you've got the long end here, so it's probably going to be about 3/4 of an inch taller. Anyways, moving on. That is why when you have a long wheelbase stretched out to give this effect, it makes your nose or tail feel steeper. When you have a short wheelbase, it makes your nose or tail feel shallower. And the difference in these two feelings is when it feels shallower, it's more responsive, like it's quicker and easier to do a trick, but you get less yield. So I find that I usually have a harder time getting a lot of pop when I have a short wheelbase or a low deck. So that kind of explains the deck version of wheelbase. So that does end the deck one. Thanks for watching. You'll have to watch the truck one next.